Millions of buyers are sitting on the real estate fence because they're waiting for the market to turn their way. But at the end of the day, you're ready to buy a house when you're ready to buy a house. When your walls are closing in on your growing family, or when the house is too big because your kids have moved out. When you're sick of paying someone else's mortgage, or when it's time to retire somewhere new. Buyers can't wait for a market shift. They need a clear path forward and wisdom from real people. That's where How to Buy comes in. You'll join me, Leo Ansoliaga, as we hear how to buy stories and advice from real buyers and the professionals who help them along the way in mortgage, real estate, insurance, financial planning, contracting, appraisal, and so much more. Now, let's jump in to today's episode. In this episode of How to Buy, Eric Fafoglia, a seasoned real estate agent, and his wife Genevieve open up about their move from the DC row home to a larger property in Great Falls, Virginia. Even with Eric's experience, they leaned on a trusted team with a clear process to help them find a home that fit both their lifestyle and long-term vision. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to tell your story because there are so many families, growing families that are in similar situation, as you both were just a few months ago, thinking about, a space, thinking about, expansion and thinking about costs, sequence. Now, the unique story here is tied to your background, Eric, obviously being a real estate professional, but yet still going through this process as a client and a consumer. So I'm excited to tell your story. I'm excited to share, what went down with your particular scenario on this podcast. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, we're excited to be here. Honored to be sitting here with the one and only Leo Enzaliaga. I mean, our guy.
Thank you. Thank you, man. Well, I guess before we get going, why don't you tell us a little bit about, the actual story? I mean, you've obviously been practicing real estate for a while, but you were also in Genevieve a consumer, right? Like an actual client that, had an expansion of family, welcomed a really, really handsome little boy into this world. And we needed a space for him to drive his cars around. And maybe tell us a little bit of that story, kind of take us back, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start. I know Genevieve's got her own side of the story, but for me, and she probably will attest this. She heard me saying it enough times while we lived in DC in that row home. Don't get me wrong, we loved our neighborhood, still love that neighborhood, miss it on occasion every other day.
Mm.
But I was ready. And Genevieve didn't hear the end of this. I was ready for the single family detached home lifestyle, right? The yard, the space, the garage, the more of a spread out kind of neighborhood feel, because that's how, similar to the way she grew up, that's how I grew up, is in a neighborhood like that with a house like that. And we wanted that for Otto, and for our dog Penny, be able to have a backyard instead of just a concrete pad to walk
Mm.
around on. So yeah, I had always kind of been looking, seeing houses with clients, interviewing neighborhoods as they're interviewing neighborhoods. I'm always thinking about these neighborhoods as, do I like this neighborhood? Did I see our family here? And so I think Genevieve heard it enough from me. But yeah, it kind of started really just with one day, honestly, and Genevieve will laugh because we don't see very many houses when we go shopping for houses. That's kind of been a pattern with us. But uh, I was just like, we saw this neighborhood. I'm like, hey, let's think about Great Falls. I think you would really like Great Falls. We should go check it out someday. And it kind of started with, let's go, spend some time in the neighborhood and go see it on a Saturday. And oh, by the way, there's this house that's listed for sale that's been sitting on the market for a few weeks, and let's go check out this house while we're there, and have a fun day. And yeah, it's kind of all history since then. That kind of was how it got started. But I know Genevieve probably has her side of the
Yeah,
story she'd want to
it's
tell.
exactly how it happened, and Leo had to have a conversation of where do we see our family, over the next 5, 10, 15, 30 years, right? You do a 30-year mortgage and you think about where do I want to be over the next 30 years?
Mm,
And then Eric and I both grew up in the Midwest. We grew up in similar neighborhoods that were very cohesive. There was either a community pool or a community lake. Really like phenomenal community of neighbors, and just really having best friends of families, and being able to have, as kids, we ran around the neighborhood and we felt safe because we knew all the parents, and we really wanted to give that experience for Otto. So even though we absolutely love living in Petworth, DC, and we love that community, we still have so many close friends there, and we do miss it a bit. We knew that we really wanted to give Otto the lifestyle and the childhood that we had. So even though we weren't ready, last year when we started, I want to say started looking, we didn't really look much, like Eric said. We just had that vision of the life we wanted to have our family have similar to ours. And my one condition was I want to be walkable to a coffee shop. And Eric said, well, if we want to have the house with the big yard and the garage, how are we going to make that happen? And we found a phenomenal community right outside Great Falls Village. It's about a 14-minute walk to one coffee shop, about 17 minutes to another. So he got me two coffee shops to walk to. And we just found the perfect location, and had to make the decision of, this is before we're necessarily ready to make this move. We weren't necessarily ready, but what are the future opportunities going to look like? And Eric was able to use some really cool tools that he had to see how often should we expect a house to come on the market in this neighborhood. And I think what we had determined was
Yeah.
maybe once a year, if that.
Yeah, it's like, you do the analysis and you can see like, okay, that's how we should make our decisions. Like, all right, is there going to be another one of these come up when we feel more ready, quote unquote? And turns out, no, they don't come up very often. And at least one's in our price point. And so we said, okay, let's do it. We'll make it happen. So,
And even the house isn't necessarily perfect. It's in the perfect location, has a great yard. And over time, I know right now we're having construction done right now, but over time we're going to make it our perfect home, and it's, somewhere where we want to raise our family. And it's been so interesting being kind of in the back seat to both you and Eric, Leo, of like what you guys do profession. When I first met you, Leo, and before we had purchased our first house, I really thought about home buying as, as a purchase, right? Like you're buying the house. But and I've been in sales a long time, so I've kind of been on the other side of it myself. But what I didn't realize after going through the process is that it really is life changing where you buy a home and where you have your family changes your life, not only because it changes your day to day of who you're spending time with, of your neighbors and your community that you're building, but also changes, it's life changing from the perspective of financially. You're really setting your family up for success, and being able to build, as we talk about, generational wealth. And I didn't really understand that until we had purchased our first home with you, and now our second. So it's been so eye opening to be on the other end of it, of how life changing it can be, and being able to get the perfect home, right? Like if we hadn't been able to work with you and have the advantages that we had with you, we wouldn't have been able to have this house, and we wouldn't have been able to build this life here. And just, 6 months of living here, 6 to 9 months of living here, it's been absolutely life changing. And we're starting to see the trajectory of the life that we're building. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without you and your help.
you and I can sometimes be a little bit disconnected from this. And I would be curious to kind of
totally.
get Genevieve's kind of perspective on this, right? But like, oftentimes consumers feel a little bit of nerves in
Mhm.
in coming to people like me and Eric, because we're like, this can get serious very, very fast. I'm not necessarily sure I'm in the marriage phase here of buying a house. I'm probably in the dating phase right now, right? But if I reach out to Eric, if I reach out to Leo, this thing becomes very real very fast. The irony of that is that, oftentimes what will happen is that you're gonna find the unicorn, and now we're scrambling, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, and we
Yeah.
miss opportunities. So Genevieve, talk a little bit about that, because that's a hurdle, I think, for consumers, right? Like
Yeah.
approaching people like me and Eric when they're in that phase of thinking things through.
Yeah. No, we definitely had that moment of after we submitted our application with you, Leo, to apply for a mortgage. And I looked at Eric, I'm like, wait, can we afford this? Like, is this something that, fits within the budget? And I think the whole time, it was nervous, but the numbers worked out. We were like, okay, we can make this happen. Like, this is a next step in our family's future. And I've never been happier with any decision, than buying our first house and now our second house. It's like I said, it truly is like finding the home and like where you want to be in this world truly is life changing. I've talked to friends who have, described their home buying experience, like outside of this team here, outside of Leo and Eric, and just hearing like these horror stories, and it makes me so grateful that we didn't have that we were in such good hands and we had that peace of mind through the process. We always knew what was going to happen next. There were no like unexpected fees or unexpected costs that that came along. And even though I had like that worry and like, to wake up in the middle of the night and think like, okay, like is this the right decision, like is this the right thing that we're doing? I had, we had you at the, backing us and like supporting us throughout the process. And so it was nice to know exactly what was going to come next and exactly what, fees. There was nothing that was unexpected in the process. And that just gives you, that much more peace of mind through the process.
Well, thank you for saying that. I think you're I mean, I think you're right in terms of like, you know, the level of uncertainty, whether you've done this, once, twice, 10 times, or whether you're married to one of the top real estate agents in this area, right? Like, it's still real, right?
Yeah.
Like it's
The
still
fear is
real
still real.
because the fear is real, right? And I think what you're saying is that, look, at the end of the day, though, if we have the right process in place, if we take step by step, not rush through things, but actually have a due diligence process, I think that that fear kind of diminishes a little bit, right? Or
Mhm.
diminishes some, which I think is a really, really important point, because I think Eric does a phenomenal job, in terms of understanding process. So there's so many people in our industry and sales in general that talk and sell themselves. And don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But at the end of the
Sure.
day, like what consumers just like you, Genevieve,
Mhm.
think about and need is a predictable process, a
Mhm.
step-by-step instruction in terms of, okay, I know I've done this before, but I don't do this every day, right? You do. What is the step-by-step process that we need to go through in order to make an educated decision that we're not going to regret 6 months, a year later,
Mhm.
et cetera. Eric, talk a little bit about that because I think that is super, super critical, right? Like having a
Hmm.
predictable process in place. I mean, and you've built an incredible process for not just your buyers, but also the sellers that you serve. Talk a little bit about that.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it comes from, experiencing the opposite, in your real life at some point of realizing, you know, it doesn't need to be chaotic, every single day. If you're running a business, it should be predictable. It should be your customer experience should be very predictable and very controllable.
I always knew it was the next step, and it allowed me to
Yeah.
sleep at night, really, is, what's gonna I'm not always wondering, like, what's next, and did we miss something? I know that, like, we've got this process and nothing's gonna get skipped, so it allows you to focus on other things in your life. I'm sure if there's anybody that if the o when they're buying a house, if that's the only thing happening in their life, I envy them, but for most people, they've got other things happening in their life. They're working a full-time job, they've got a family, there's other things going on, and
Hmm.
it's great to have that process, that Eric's built to back them through it and, able to walk them through, to have that peace of mind.
Yeah, and I think, as a takeaway from this, as a consumer, right? If you don't have a husband or a spouse on the other side that's selling real estate, the one question I would encourage you to ask whoever you're interviewing to represent you is, what is the step-by-step process you're gonna take me through? Can you please show me that in writing, right? Can you show me that, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4? Because I think at the end of the day, like you said, Genevieve, they don't do this every day, right? They have a full-time job and they don't need to be worried about, whether or not we missed the home inspection deadline or, if the appraisal has come back, you know what I mean? Like all that
Mhm.
stuff needs to be yielded, taken away from them via the professionals that obviously have that step-by-step
Yeah.
process. This is the other variable, and I'm going to let Genevieve talk here from her perspective on this because I think this is super important. I always tell friends of mine, people that I talk to on a regular basis, you know, um, it's important for you to align yourself with a real estate professional that doesn't just talk about the fastballs or some of the fastballs that they hit, right? But people that have actually hit curveballs, right? Like, because at the end of the day, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, right? That's what Mike Tyson at least said, right? And so aligning yourself with a professional that knows how to hit curveballs and you don't necessarily feel it, right? Because they've got this thing handled is extremely important. Now, Genevieve, I know that you're married to the guy, right? And he would never do this for himself. And Eric, you're allowed not to say anything in this section because we're going to let Genevieve talk here, right? But like what makes this man so good at his job? I can tell you from my perspective, I can tell you
Yeah.
what I see, right? But this guy knows how to hit curveballs. This guy knows how
Yeah.
to write, a predictable process and take people through this process smoothly. But talk
Mhm.
from your perspective as a client, as
Uh,
a spouse, what makes Eric so special in this industry?
The number one thing is that Eric cares more than anyone I've ever met, and he deeply, deeply cares to make sure that every person has everything that they need, that, he's thinking 7, 8, 9, 10 steps ahead to make sure that, that curveball that they anticipate the curveball to make sure he handles it correctly. He cares so deeply about his clients, and it really shows. And I've seen that on my end of like how diligent he is and how meticulous he is at out of, making sure every single detail is lined up, but also hearing from these clients of like how it's changed their lives. The fact that they were able to get their dream home in their dream neighborhood and their lives have been absolutely changed and they love their neighbors and they wouldn't be in that position. They wouldn't have that life if it weren't for Eric and how meticulous he is. And it's so wonderful to see it come for full circle when I'm on the other end and I see he's up late at night, checking all the details, making sure that everything is taken care of and that he's thinking, 6, 9, 7 steps ahead. And seeing it on the back end of how happy and how grateful his clients are for, making sure that they are able to land where they want to land or, sell the property in a timely manner and get the price that they want. And it's only positive, feedback, and it really shows just based on how much he cares.
I definitely, would love to kind of get your thoughts, both of you. Obviously, Eric, you specifically working with so many, mortgage professionals. And just for the record and for the sake of this podcast, you want to make sure that you align yourself with someone that, that fits what you're looking for, right? We're
Hmm.
probably not going to be the right fit for everyone, right? Our firm, but we're going to be the fit for a lot of clients, right? What was it about our process, our firm that convinced you that we were the right party to partner with? Because Eric, I mean, you do a lot of business with some really talented professionals in our space as well. So can you give us a little bit of insight there in terms of what
Hmm.
what was it about our firm that convinced you that we were the right fit for you?
Yeah, I think it's just like you align your process really aligns with what I believe in and what I, do every day and what I've decided to build in my, my business. And that is being organized and having a process that's written out and that's very transparent to clients. Like you have this wonderful roadmap that you share of just like, this is how it's going to happen. And this is the way the best way to do it and make sure that we don't skip any steps and we get education first before we make decisions. So, it just feels very confident. It's very confidence inspiring to know that, someone is helping us with our mortgage, this thing we're going to have for the next 5, 10 years, however long we live here. And, we already talked about, you're already thinking about the refinance and watching out for that for us when the right time comes. But it's so just confidence inspiring to have someone that has thought about all the ifs, ands, and buts and what ifs that could happen and put it into a really polished process so that you knew how to be creative for us when the right time was to lock the interest rates, right? Because we floated our rate. We kind of did something unique there. And so you had a lot of creativity for us because you've got everything else ironed out. You've got the process, the basics all ironed out with really thoroughness, then it allows you to be very creative with us, and spend a lot more one-on-one time with us throughout the process, which is great. So I'd say, that's why we ultimately, picked you to work with for our personal house and for the last house. So yeah, Genevieve, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was gonna say I have a funny story for you, Leo, about that kind of just reflects on how much we enjoy working with you and like people's responses to, what we were able to accomplish with you. So when we moved into our new home, Otto and I were playing in the front yard, and our neighbor, who we hadn't met yet, came driving by and stopped to introduce herself and say hello. And she said, "It's so funny. My husband and I left for a 2-week cruise. When we left, the house was still for sale, but when we came back from our cruise, someone had already moved into the home." And she kind of looked at me like, like, "Did you buy this in cash?" She had that look on her face, like, really confused, like, "What's going on here? How did you guys make that happen?" And I said, "We've got a phenomenal mortgage lender who was able to be really creative, and was able to, make it happen for us. So we were able to move really quickly, and, we're really happy that we were able to get here, in such a short period of time." So that was kind of funny to see her reaction of, of how she left and came back and someone had already moved into the house. But what's so great about that, and throughout that process, is we didn't have to sell our house in DC before moving. We were able to get fully moved out of there so that Eric could, completely stage the old house, get it on the market, in a, I think I forget what holiday we were kind of, I think it was before Thanksgiving. So we wanted to make sure it was, on the market before Thanksgiving, and he was able to get that, very high price point for it. So you helping us make that move quickly, and be able to move into our new home before selling our old home, and have that time in between, really helped us set us up for success, and efficiently sell the old home.
Yeah, and I think well, thank you for that. I didn't know that story. That's actually amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think strategy, execution, relationships really, really matter in this industry, right? Having the right strategy, the right relationships, and then ultimately the overall execution. Because you as you brought up that point about selling before you buy, right? So I think what you're referencing is we have a program called the Buy Before You Sell program, or where we essentially, can have you purchase the new property before you sell the other one. Oftentimes, in a market like this, right? Like you can't necessarily have a contingency of sale in order to be able to compete in the market. Meaning, the property needs to sell before you buy, right? Most sellers that have multiple offers are just not going to take, that offer because it's a little bit riskier for them. And the flip side of this, and the strategy also though applies on the sales side, right? I can't tell you how many times Eric has said this, to me in the past. And this is how the majority of the top professionals think, right? Consumers cannot envision themselves in a home unless that home is more neutral, right? The space is not necessarily as personalized. And so being able to move out of the house, right, which is the majority of the cases will be the ideal scenario, is super important. So Eric, talk a little bit about that because I think the strategy also applies in making sure that we can have the property stage and allow the actual potential buyer to see themselves in a new home. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. That was huge. I mean, that just for our situation, we've got a dog. We had an au pair living with us, and of course, we have our son, who is running around the house. And so, the thought of having to, shuffle everybody out for showings every time someone wanted to see the house is like, well, that's obnoxious, right? Like, I get it. I'm living, the thought of doing that, it's like, well, if we could totally be out of this house and moved into our new house and make this house look perfect. I know from experience, and you know this too, just from hearing it and being part of this industry, is it's always going to be an easier sale. And when it's an easier sale, when then you're going to get a higher price. So it's always going to be easier when someone's moved out and the house is depersonalized.
Mm,
And some people have homes that we walk into that look like they've been staged because their interior design is 10 out of 10. And some people, it's like, all right, great. Maybe we don't actually have to do that. It would probably still be easier on them not having to leave for showings and for open houses. And sometimes there's a lot of showings. But still, very few people have a house that's like that, ready to go and looking the best it possibly could, right? Because what we're doing is we're taking a house, as a blank slate and saying, how can we make this house worth the most it possibly could be in its current condition? And that means probably getting the refrigerator cleaned out so it doesn't smell like all the food that's in there, the coat closet that smells like wet shoes, your laundry room that's full of stuff, and your closet that's got clothes everywhere, some, not their clothes that they're walking, when the buyer's walking through, they're like, these are someone else's clothes and belongings. So we're trying to neutralize the house, as you said, and make it look as ready for them as humanly possible, right?
Mm,
But also cozy and, homey and inviting. And so having a house be emptied and staged is the best way to do that. And your program allowed us to do that. We were able to buy this house and totally move over. And, the way we did it is like, I'm like, okay, as soon as we got under contract on our new house to buy, I'm like, okay, time to start getting to work on our current house, right? So we had contractors come in, start giving us quotes for paint and getting the house ready. So that way we're all lined up. As soon as we moved out, we executed and got people in the house to start painting it, cleaning it up, and then getting it staged so that I could turn around and put it on the market 10 days later after we moved out, which was pretty incredible that the dominoes fell like that. And then we had an offer the first weekend going on the market. So the
mm,
overlap time of having two mortgages was like minimal. I think we actually didn't pay our first mortgage, or our first payment on our new mortgage until after we had sold and closed on our last house, which was crazy. So we didn't actually have two
Incredible.
payments at all.
Yeah.
That's what happens when you have an organized team, right?
Yeah.
That's how having organization and having that system, knowing how to get the dominoes and having all the vendors in your back pocket that can make, move around schedules for you becomes ultra important. And so your program allowed us to pull that off. And
mm,
I know for certain we wouldn't have gotten as much or possibly sold first weekend um, without having been moved out of that house.
mm. Fear, false evidence is appearing real, right? Having the right plan, having the right strategy, the execution, that's important. But fear is a real thing. And so as we close this out, I want to hear the perspective of both a real estate professional and a client, right? That perhaps not perhaps, but it's married to one, right? How do you deal with the fear of the future, right? So a lot of consumers are nervous. Let's be honest, right? We live in the DC metropolitan area, and they're nervous. There's so many variables just in this area alone, okay, about the economy, about housing, et cetera. And we forecast forward on a regular basis, and we usually forecast forward, with fear, right? What if this happens? What if that happens, right? And so, how do you navigate that as a client? How do you navigate that as a real estate professional? Like a lot of people are nervous about, where the economy is going or where housing is going. Now, I have my perspective on that, but I want to hear from you both. I want to hear from you both. How do you account for that? Specifically in this particular area. Genevieve?
Well, talk about fear, Leo. We bought our first house with you in March of 2020. So that was, and we were both in commission only jobs at that point. So yeah, so talk about fear, it was definitely there. And that experience really opened. I mean, I was fearful, the first like 6 months of moving to that home and can we afford this mortgage? And really like when we made that decision to purchase that home, it was obviously before we knew about anything about COVID. And so we were like, like you said, we did it before we were ready. We knew where we wanted to be. We knew what type of house we wanted. Eric only ever showed me one house and he said, "Can you imagine yourself living here?" And I said, "Yes." And so we applied for a mortgage with you and made the offer. But it is hard to deal with, I think, through the process. Like you are afraid, but fact of the matter is we looked at the numbers and we figured out, yes, we can afford this. Like worst case scenario, this is what this is going to look like. Best case scenario, this is what it's going to look like. And it was one of the best decisions we ever made.
Mm,
And so going through that experience and coming out on the other end of learning that if you are strategic, like yes, overall, like there's a lot in the news, a lot of negativity and a lot of stats that can make you really afraid. But what is your individual situation and can you make this work? And is this the right thing for you and your family and
mm.
setting you up for success in the long run? And for us it was, and going through that experience and seeing that it was one, even though we were very fearful and there was a lot of uncertainty in the world at that point, it was one of the best decisions we ever made. And and it just made it that much easier to take this next step and make the purchase of a second home, and having confidence in it.
That is so true, and that's true wisdom there. This gentleman by the name of Dr. Man once told me that, you know, The possibility of anything happening is always 50-50, right? You can flip a coin, it's always going to be 50-50. The question though is, do we live in possibilities or do we live in probabilities? What is the probability of XYZ fear happening, right? It's much smaller than that, he said, and I think one of the statistics that we need to pay attention is probability. What is the probability, not just the possibility of whatever fear that we have in front of us? Because to your point, Genevieve, we miss a lot of times for that reason, right? We miss perhaps an opportunities to build community, right, with amazing people in DC, opportunities to build a new community here in Virginia. And so I think to your point, like, let's focus on the probability of things happening, not just the possibilities. Guys, this was such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much again for allowing us to talk through your story and sharing this with our community.
Definitely. It's fun to
Thanks,
reflect
Leo.
on experience and, yeah, thanks for having us, Leo.
Makes us very grateful for sure. Nice renewed gratification of the process and the team and the house.
Thank you guys.